Going to get started shortly. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you for that. We see the room is filling up, which is good news. Wonderful. I think we've got a few more people. If you can take your seats, we'll get started. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session. It's all about driving e-mobility in Asia Pacific and beyond. My name is Sharanjeet Lail. It's a real delight and pleasure to be your host and moderator for this session. Now, over the next 90 minutes, we'll aim to explore key trends in key transport, including the ADB's approach to promoting e-mobility across all major transport forms, such as rail, buses, metro, and of course, electric vehicles. Now, we've brought together a great panel of speakers, all of whom, of course, play a very critical role in the successful transformation of e-mobility at a time of climate change. So I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, who will set the stage for us in terms of the importance of green transport. Ramesh Subramaniam is the Director General of the Chief Sectors Group from the Asian Development Bank, who's going to kick off with an overview of the ADB's assistance of e-mobility in sovereign and non-sovereign operations. Please, a round of applause for Ramesh.
Thank you so much, Sharanjeet, and good afternoon to all of you. Nice to see a number of you, and hopefully more will be coming. It's my privilege to welcome you all to this workshop, and particularly those of you who are coming from outside of Georgia. Special welcome to Tbilisi, and we are obviously super happy to be hosting this. This seminar, Driving E-Mobility in Developing Asia and the Pacific, if I say this is coming at a critical juncture, that'll be a cliche. We all know, particularly those of us coming from developing countries in Asia, elsewhere, know the urban mobility challenges that we face. Tbilisi seems actually okay. I don't know what people of Tbilisi feel, but come to Manila, where we are based at the ADB, or to Jakarta, or to New Delhi, or to Mumbai, or Chennai, the city where I come from, you know what we are talking about in terms of the need for change and the transformation that we need to go through. Because urban air quality, just to start with, is a huge challenge. And then you've got lots and lots of other challenges in terms of lack of mobility, what that means. So transportation obviously forms the backbone of economies by connecting people to jobs, education, healthcare, and obviously economic opportunities. But this comes at a cost. Obviously, transportation contributes nearly a quarter of the global carbon dioxide emissions. Now, this is a very alarming statistic, but it also underscores the critical need for urgent and transformative action, which is why we are gathered here today. The panel will be going into a number of the aspects. In Asia and the Pacific, the region has been experiencing rapid transport demand expansion. The shift to e-mobility presents not just challenges, but also immense opportunities. Asia, in fact, is already leading the way globally in e-vehicle or electric vehicle adoption, being home to over 95% of the world's e-vehicles. While this is very impressive, these figures represent a relatively small fraction of the total vehicles we have in many of the Asian cities as well as countries, underscoring the need for accelerating the transition from the polluting vehicles to electric alternatives. Again, Manila, I'll take the liberty of being home to ADB. We've got the jeepneys, or you have tuk-tuks in many parts of the world, the autos in India, for instance. All of these obviously need to be transitioned. Now, obviously, all of this needs a lot of money, but more than money is important, but equally important is enabling policy frameworks, which need to be effective and efficient for scaling up e-mobility. Many developing economies have robust e-mobility policies, but there are a number of others that yet need to effectively integrate these policies into their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, or other long-term strategies leading to net zero. This obviously highlights a need for a more integrated approach and closer coordination between transport and climate policies at both national as well as global levels. At the ADB, we are super committed to supporting this transformation through a comprehensive approach that spans all major transport forms. To date, ADB has financed over 75,000 e-vehicles and more than 5,000 kilometers of electric railways, affecting positively millions of daily lives and contributing to the creation of thousands of jobs. Just this year, the Green Climate Fund approved $170 million of funding to ADB for decarbonization of the transport sector that, along with ADB's own resources, will finance about close to $500 million of investments in 7 of our developing member countries. The e-mobility program, this program that I just mentioned, aims to foster a transformational shift in public transport across 7 countries. Many of them are in Central Asia and the Caucasus, including Georgia, potentially mitigating around 11.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent over 25 years and benefiting millions directly and indirectly. Our private sector operations, Mayank will be speaking later, Kathy is here, many other colleagues, they've been doing tremendous, putting in tremendous efforts in this space. In Georgia, for example, we've invested in the pioneering Tegeta Green Vehicles Bond project. In Thailand, our private sector operations have supported the financing of e-tuk-tuks. And in Vietnam, we contributed to creating the first national electric vehicle charging network. Now, through ADB's finance, sovereign finance, enabling environment, as well as private sector finance, we seek to catalyze investments that advance large-scale adoption of green transport solutions. Now, decarbonization policies such as incentives for EV purchase and support for renewable energy integrations are very, very critical. Now, they are the key ingredient in establishing an overall enabling environment to decarbonize the transport sector. They not only help mitigate the environmental impacts, but also enhance energy security and economic resilience. Now, there may be scientists and researchers in this audience. The innovations, the work that you are doing in battery technology and renewable energy solutions are the backbone of this transition. We are at the tip of this transition. A lot more needs to happen in terms of new advances and innovations. We at the ADB, as a knowledge institution promoting innovation, we depend on your expertise to expand the boundaries of what is possible in e-mobility. And to our institutional investors, and maybe people with money, whether pension funds, others who are investing, your strategic insights and financial commitments are vital for scaling up the e-mobility solutions. So thank you all very much for your commitment to this transformative journey. And we look forward to collaborating with you. And this panel will be very exciting in looking at a whole range of issues. Thank you so much, Sharanjit. Thanks all.
Thank you, Ramesh. And thank you for so ably underscoring why this panel is so urgent. Of course, you know, a massive amount of global emissions out there, and we need to cut it. So let me introduce our amazing panelists for the session. We have Philip Turner, Director for Global Advocacy and Engagement at SLOCAT. This is an organization made up of partnerships that are powering a just transition towards healthy, green, resilient transport and mobility systems for people and the planet. A round of applause for Philip, please. Thank you. You can come and join me here. Next, we have Mayank Chowdhury. He's the Director from the Infrastructure Finance Division and Private Sector Operations Department from the ADB. He has more than 22 years of corporate finance, investment banking, private equity, and project finance experience in the infrastructure sector across Asia. Thank you, Mayank. A round of applause. And next, from right here in Georgia, we have Manana Kinashvili She did tell me how to pronounce her name. I hope I have done it justice. She is the head of investor relations at Tajeta. And of course, we know that's a leading automotive company in Georgia. She expanded its investor base to include 500 institutional, individual, international, and local stakeholders. And of course, amongst these transactions that she will go on to talk about is the issuance of the first green bond in collaboration with the ADB, the first of its kind in the automotive sector across the entire region. And next up we have Jamie Leather, the Director for the Transport Sector Group from the ADB, with over 30 years of experience in transport, working in different parts of the world with development organizations, governments, private sector, and research institutions. Finally, we have Samir Aggarwal. He's the founder and CEO of Revfin Services, which is transforming the EV ecosystem and driving the adoption of electric vehicles across India with a specific focus on the financially excluded segment. Welcome. A big round of applause, please. And thank you all for being here. And I'm so excited for the next 90 minutes or so. We'll have this conversation. But of course, it's not just a conversation amongst ourselves. We want to hear from you. So please, we'll have a QR code that's going to come up on the screen shortly. Take your phones out, scan it, because this is your chance to ask us questions, and I will be putting your questions to our panelists at the end of the session. There's your QR code. If you could all take your phones, your tablets out right now, scan it, please. I would love to be able to, of course, pose your questions to our panelists. But let's start with an opening question to all of you, and really just to answer briefly about how you and your organizations are contributing to reducing global greenhouse gases, which, as you just heard Ramesh says, he said it contributes to nearly a quarter of the global carbon dioxide emissions. So really a chance to know where you stand on this debate. Let's start with you, Philip.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here. So SLOCAT is a multi-stakeholder partnership which brings together around 100 organizations globally. And we are essentially the voice of the sustainable transport community in the international climate talks, but also the wider sustainability agenda. Our focus is on the land transport sector. So we bring together all sustainable transport modes, walking, cycling, public transport, rail, but also city authorities, national governments, UN agencies. So our mission is very much ensuring that ambitious global agreements harness the full benefit of sustainable transport. Secondly, raising awareness with national governments on the actions and the policies that they can take on sustainable transport. And finally, really enhance the dialogue between state and non-state actors. So SLOCAT is the co-focal point for the UNFCCC in the transport sector. So really that's about raising awareness on what works and what doesn't.
Good to know. That's a long list. Mayank.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. So as I was introduced, I am the private sector part of ADB. So since this sector is very new, it's about 4 to 5 years since we have been engaged in this sector, but we have been fortunate enough to actually been able to work across geographies, across instrument types, which I'll talk about subsequently later in this panel discussion. So we have right from battery manufacturing, charger manufacturing to vehicle manufacturing, including two-wheelers, light commercial vehicles, buses, to charging infrastructure, to financing of infrastructure, EVs. Across the spectrum, we have created these lighthouse projects, which actually can act as a signal or a trigger for the broader commercial market, to start adopting. So I will get a chance to speak about it later in details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayank. And I should have gone to Jamie first, because they're both ADB, but they represent two different, different parts of the ADB. We'll hear from Jamie a little bit. But Manana, tell us about Tajeta.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here from the host country, and it's a great pleasure to speak about our company. So Tegeta is the leader company in automotive industry, not only in Georgia, but also in the Caucasus. So since, I would say, 1995, we're trying to be pioneering in different areas of the automotive and not only even the financial instruments that we've been using. And as you have mentioned, the green bonds transactions and different ones. And in terms of the climate changes and e-mobility, we've started about 5 years ago to modernize the vehicles in Georgia, and we've imported like hybrid vehicles and started to import electric vehicles as well, and established charging stations for these electric vehicles as well. So we're representatives of the exclusive representatives of different brands all around the globe, like 500 and more. Porsche, Volvo, and other brands that are manufacturing EV charging stations as well, and as well as for the vehicles. That's
wonderful.
summary.
That's a great list of things. And of course, we'll hear a little bit more about the green bonds in a bit. Jamie, yes, please do distinguish what you do from Mayank within the ADB.
Well, let me start. ADB is totally committed. We have announced ourselves as the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific. It's all very well just saying that, but we're putting financial resources behind that. Cumulatively to 2030, we are committed to provide financial support for $100 billion US, and happy to say at the moment, we're on track for that, and it's through investments like e-mobility, through rail as a lower part, but also across in other sectors as well. So that's the corporate level. We've heard that there's a private sector role and a sovereign support, that enabling environment that Ramesh was referring to at the beginning. Even within the sector, it probably goes beyond that. We are looking at how the transport sector can work with the energy sector to make sure there's collaboration, how we can work with our urban colleagues to work with cities to make sure that function and livability and sustainability of the city is also be decarbonising. So corporately, we have set these targets. The sovereign support, the policy, the investments, and certainly the private sector, and working with our other energy sectors, urban sectors, and industry to see how we can push that agenda forward. And the number was given at the beginning. It's around a quarter of sector emissions. Transport falls under that hard-to-abate area, so what can we do to push the very impressive numbers we've seen, but it's a very small point at the moment. How can we accelerate that uptick in the e-mobility? Thank you.
Thank you, and we hope to hear more about that just a little bit later when we get into the session. And Samir, finally, from Revfin's point of view.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Revfin finances commercial electric vehicles in India. We provide finance in form of loans and leases for electric vehicles. So far, we have financed over 50,000 electric vehicles, and today we are present in over 750 towns and cities in India. I think one of the things that we observe is that a lot of the electric vehicle adoption is happening in smaller towns from people who come from a near bottom of the pyramid social strata. So we've been working a lot with that customer segment. Over 96% of our customers come from non-tier 1 cities, and over 85% of our customers are financially excluded and have never taken a loan in the past.
Thank you, and very good to know. We'll talk a little bit about that customer base of yours a little later as well. But let's move on to Manana now. Of course, you mentioned Tegeta and all the incredible things Tegeta is doing, and one of which was really to issue the first green bond and very much contributing to decarbonising the transport sector in Georgia by doing that. Talk us through Tegeta's motivation and experience in that, and the role that the ADB played in that.
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. I would start with the ADB's role in this transaction. That's been crucial for us to achieve these numbers that I will go through. It's been a year already that we have issued this bond. This transaction was one of a kind in Caucasus and in Georgia. Like green bonds, we've issued 20 million gel. That's the national currency of Georgia as well. And for this, we have another aim to give 5 times investments to the country for the EV direction. So this translates into 100 million lari gel investments in EV direction And not only speaking of the mobility and the vehicles itself, but speaking of the charging stations, that is the crucial part to modernize and decarbonize the country. Like as of today, we have achieved the numbers, like we've imported more than 200 vehicles already and purchased 70 charging stations already that we start to establish all around the country for the use of the end users to make it more appealing and so on. So step by step we will establish. And speaking of the motivation of the company, since I have mentioned that our suppliers are from all over the world, like the leading companies, so these companies are moving towards the decarbonization, GHG emissions reductions, and so we also want to move to this path and increase the Georgia's, and not only Georgia's, decarbonization impacts, and be the leader in the country who will contribute. And hopefully we've seen another bond in a month, like last year, 1 month later, since we've issued as well. And we've seen another instance from the financial institutions as well, from the private companies. That is very important for us to see, since we'll be honored to share our experience working with ADB and achieving these great things here. Yeah.
That's great to hear, and perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more about ADB's role in that, those amazing strides that Taget is making. Now, Philip, you mentioned earlier, obviously SLOCAT represents sustainable, low-carbon transport. It plays a pivotal role for the transport sector in global agreements. So what have you seen in terms of the transport sector's involvement in the global climate change debate?
Okay, I've been going to COPs now, well, so the climate talks for a decade and a half now. You thought I would have learnt better. But the question brings very happy memories and some terrible ones. But I think the transport discussion at the COP has evolved significantly. When I first started, we weren't even allowed to talk about sectors. It was only emissions and economy-wide issues. I was even told not to talk about transport in certain meetings. And I think really the turning point actually came in 2014 at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit, where he tasked non-state actors, i.e. anyone other than government, to come up with initiatives to say what they're going to be doing to address climate change, from e-mobility initiatives to rail to public transport. And essentially that was designed to put pressure on governments to come up with an agreement in Paris. But the important thing for me is that the Paris Agreement built on that and set up a formal mechanism where the COP presidency appoint champions to build that relationship with the state and non-state actors and set targets in key areas where they feel that the big gains need to be met. And in the transport sector, we saw a lot of targets being set around e-mobility, covering the different modes. And I really see that this has been taken up by the COP presidencies themselves, where they are coming up with their own initiatives, especially around e-mobility, where countries are actually signing up to do things. But so it's really gained that momentum, and I think at COP28 in December this year, we made a significant breakthrough. Transport was recognised for the first time in the agreement, and it calls on countries to essentially look at emissions reductions through a range of pathways in the road transport sector, looking at infrastructure investments and how to scale up low emission vehicles and zero emission vehicles. So you can actually see the whole evolution of how transport has featured within that debate. And I think that's also now being reflected by countries. So every 5 years, countries have to update their national climate strategies. In their first set, they only set 20% of all the strategies looked at transport, and only around sort of 3% set targets. 5 years later, 98% specify transport, 33% target emissions reductions in the sector, and importantly, half of all the interventions actually put forward by government is geared at e-mobility solutions. So I've seen that massive evolution over the course of a decade, and I think really the challenge now is you've got all these commitments, now you actually have to go and deliver them.
That's a tough call, isn't it? And great that you have personally seen those massive strides being taken. Let's hope for yet more strides. Mayank, I mean, you talked a little bit about your role within the ADB earlier, and obviously, you know, the urgent need to transition to cleaner transport. Talk us through the different private financing instruments that are available out there to boost e-mobility, because this is crucial. Money is crucial, as we heard Ramesh say earlier. And tell us a little bit about the trends or projects in the private sector that you're seeing, particularly in e-mobility, where the ADB has been involved.
Yes. So this is a very important question, because this is the whole, foundation of these discussions as to what can, because this will be led by the private sector. I mean, governments will frame policies, government will provide some subsidy, some will implement environment, but ultimately this whole thing has to be driven by the private sector. So at the private sector operations department of ADB, we have actually used primarily two instruments to actually support, except Tegeta, which was a green bond, which is a separate discussion we can have on this. But primarily two instruments are an early stage venture investing through our ADB Ventures program and through a blended finance, some concessional loan blended with commercial finance from ADB by mobilizing other commercial lenders. So if I can give some examples, through ADB Ventures program, we have created e-mobility as a service platform in India. For last mile connectivity for the logistics companies. There is another company which is actually manufacturing light commercial vehicles, electric light commercial vehicles, and selling to various, again, delivery platforms which are using last mile connectivity. There is actually our investee company, Revfin, which is actually accelerating financing for EVs. That's also playing a very important role. In Vietnam, we have created supported a company which is manufacturing electric scooters, again for logistics. And in Bangladesh, we have created a battery swapping network across the country. So these are, you can see, these are very small, early stage investments to create, this whole ecosystem which is missing. And of course, the sector, as you know, is dominated by large international automobile manufacturers, which are actually not focusing on this. And as part of all these investments, what is also happening is we are also pushing through with creation of infrastructure, which is charging infrastructure. And also a very important aspect which people miss out in what electricity is being used to charge these vehicles. If it is from the grid, which is in most of our developing member countries, is still primarily coal or gas driven, you are actually removing tailpipe emissions, but you're actually not mitigating CO2 emissions. So yes, you're solving air pollution problem, but you're not solving global warming problem. So we are trying to create platforms which actually use renewable energy for charging. So I'll come to some of those examples. So through our commercial activity, which is lending primarily for ADB, we are using blended finance programs. So we have certain pool of capital which donors have provided us, which can be blended with commercial financing from ADB and other commercial sources to accelerate some of the higher risk or high cost investments which are needed. So we all know that, right? On a total cost of ownership basis, electric vehicles are cheap as compared to ICE, internal combustion engine vehicles, but upfront cost is very high. So that needs support. So we use blended finance program. So we have under that program, Turks manufacturing. There is a battery manufacturing we have done. We have deployed electric buses in India on long-term intercity routes. Then we have actually supported a company which most people are aware of, VinFast in Vietnam, which is actually manufacturing electric buses and rolling out charging infrastructure across the country. So through this, we have gained certain experiences, certain models are emerging, and those models we hope to replicate and roll out across a wider spectrum of developing member countries.
Thank you for that. That is an extraordinary number of activities you're involved in, and really interesting to hear how you are going into these markets, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, Georgia, to create the ecosystem that's necessary to enable e-mobility. You mentioned working with Revfin there, and that brings me to Samir very nicely. So Samir, tell us about what you see in your market in India about electric mobility transforming the last mile commute for the lower middle income population that you say you serve. Can electric vehicles realistically replace your traditional internal combustion engine vehicles in India? Is that likely to happen at any stage?
Well, the short answer is yes. It can and it will happen. And I can say with confidence in India that will happen in the next 2 to 3 years. Now, let me just set some context. Last mile mobility for passengers in India is dominated by three-wheelers. Today, 55%, even more than 55% of three-wheelers sold in India are electric. And if you look at in the mid-income group in smaller towns, it's interesting because most of the adoption is over there. Over 80% of new three-wheelers being sold are electric. If you look at some of the northern states of India, they tend to be very highly populated, very dense population. You go to small towns over there, you see nothing but electric vehicles, right? So they've directly leapfrogged from driving manual rickshaws, cycle rickshaws, to electric, and there was no ice in between, right? So I think, that adoption is surely happening. Of course, it's not an easy adoption. It provides a lot of opportunities because electric vehicles actually do help people make more money than ICE vehicles, either because of the operational cost saving in terms of fuel costs, but also depending on the type of vehicles. India has this unique product called an e-rickshaw, which is like a 1 meter wide three-wheeler, which runs on batteries. It costs less than $2,000. So it's actually very cheap as well to buy and run. Right? So I think those are some of the opportunities.
Yeah, that's very impressive. And as we saw at the opening video as well, India has incredibly impressive ambitions towards e-mobility. And you've just spelt it out for us, the fact that they will all be e-mobile vehicles in 2 to 3 years. That is extraordinary and wonderful to hear. Now, Jamie, we've already heard from Manana a little bit about how the ADB played a pivotal role in helping to get with its first green bond. But how do you see the role of multinational development banks like the ADB in supporting an enabling environment for e-mobility? And, we heard a little bit about that from Mayank earlier as well.
Thank you. The role of MDBs or ADB in particular is really to, as you said, that enabling environment, but what technical and financial support can we provide to our governments and private sector? I think all of the panelists have shown how there is a need for that integration. Just to reiterate that point, the 4 countries that our private sector operations have been working in mostly and highlighting it's no accident that those are the 4 of the 5 countries in the region that have by far the greatest depth in their e-mobility policies. And that de-risks the private sector investments. So coming from the sovereign side, in terms of decarbonisation of the sector and promotion of e-mobility, we're very much in favour of the avoid, shift, improve mantra for decarbonisation of the sector. Avoiding, as we unfortunately all realised during COVID, reducing the need for travel, working from home. So that's the avoid part of less emissions, less travel. Shifting to different modes. That can be on freight. Rail, water-based transport is far more energy efficient, therefore emits a lot less. And in urban areas, public transport, non-motorised transport, e-vehicles, much less emitting than private combustion engines. So let avoid, shift, improve. The reason we're here talking on e-mobility, yes, it's attractive, it's getting a lot of attention, but in that avoid, shift and improve for the decarbonisation of the sector, the vast majority of benefits or decarbonisation are likely to come from technological improvements. In land-based transport, shifting from internal combustion engines, the ICE vehicles, to e-mobility or hybrid through that transition. But when I said we're helping in that decarbonisation pathway to governments to set those policies, we're not just looking at land transport, we're looking at maritime, aviation, and some Fruit is very low-hanging. Again, no surprise, we're hearing a lot on two-wheelers and three-wheelers. We're hearing a lot about electric buses because the analysis shows that the tipping point from capital cost, purchase cost, and operating cost has already been reached. So if you have perfect knowledge, you should be, and you want to purchase a two-wheeler or a three-wheeler or a fleet vehicle in urban areas, or a taxi fleet, or a bus fleet, it's a no-brainer decision. You should be going down the electric route if you have that knowledge and if you're looking at full life cycle. As was said, the capital cost is higher, but the downstream operating costs are lower. So the tipping point has been reached. And again, picking up the issue in terms of e-mobility in Asia is very different from other parts of the world, particularly North America or Europe. The types of trips, the types of vehicles are quite different. If any of you have visited South or Southeast Asia, and I guess Vietnam is perhaps the most well-known in terms of its sea of two-wheelers coming at you as you try to cross the street, but many South and Southeast Asian countries are the same. That tipping point in those types of vehicles has been reached. So that, on the financial part, if this is to feed through into private sector investments and decisions, it will be a financial investment not steered by the policies, but who will make those investments and that requirement. That's the low-hanging fruit. The sort of middle-hanging fruit are the private four-wheelers, the trucks, aviation and maritime. Unfortunately, at the moment, fruit higher up the tree. But as Ramesh was saying, if there's any technology researchers in the audience, we will look at this and bring those in, and that's that full decarbonisation pathway. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And as you say, there's so many elements to it. It is incredibly complex to get to the next stage, but it looks like here within the region, we have managed to get there. It's really about hastening that pace. At this point of the conversation, I realize we still have a full hour ahead. I would love to hear from you in the audience. So if you had a chance to scan the QR code a little bit earlier, I do want to ask your questions, and I'm sure you have many, many questions for our very engaging panelists here. They've already spoken so much about this sector, but I'm sure you're very curious to hear. There are no questions at the moment. I do hope that you'll think up some great ones over the next half an hour or so. Manana, I'm going to move over to you now. A very similar question to you that I just asked Jamie, but in a different area. What is your recommendation to other private companies like yourself, or even public sector entities, to further help support e-mobility? What kind of advice would you give them?
Thanks. That's also a brilliant question as well. Short answer there is that go for it. So there are no limitations where you shouldn't do it or should not do it. So this is the future, and the future is today. So there's no another answer that you go or no go. And the technical support you're getting within these bond issuances or even the loan disbursements on anything, that's enormous. Like I see Begum from Sustainalytics here, she helped us very well. So I see David and the ADB team here who were very supportive with this transition. And yes, even though the journey might seem a bit long, it's fruitful and it's yes, and you'll get the support you need. For the private sector, that's we are the drivers here for the changes. Even sometimes in prior to the public sector itself, like for example, I was speaking about the 70 chargers for the EVs, like we've started to implement that step by step, but without the public support and the governmental support, it wouldn't be possible. So we're covering the whole Georgia, we're covering the Tbilisi itself, and the support from the government and city hall is enormous here. They also encourage us to do that. And yes, there's no limit to doing that. And as for the light vehicles, I wouldn't stop for only the individual purposes. Jamie also has mentioned about the buses here. So here, if transitioning is the crucial for the road vehicles itself and non-road vehicles, infrastructural developments for the projects. Like Georgia is very heavy on industrial infrastructural projects as well. And we do have capability to provide these vehicles and techniques and all of the support so they need. So there are other players in the country in terms of automotive industry and the financial support as well, like leasing instruments and banking instruments are very attractive pricing here, have very attractive pricing here. So they should also join this ecosystem to make this change today.
Thank you. And as you point out, government support is crucial. That's the voice that we're lacking on our panel at the moment, but it'd be interesting to hear from any government sector individuals who might be in the audience. We'd love your input. Once again, if you had a chance to scan that QR code, we'd love to hear from you. And yes, I mean, political capital absolutely necessary in trying to achieve e-mobility milestones. Philip, I'm moving on to you next because obviously you've come across many of those politicians at many of the COP and other climate summits that you've been to. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges to the uptake of e-mobility solutions around the world? And what are some of the opportunities? We know there are plenty.
Okay, I think the biggest challenge is that we've got 2 years to get it right. National governments have to come forward at COP30 at the end of next year to outline their new climate strategies. And these essentially have to say what countries are going to do by 2035. The decision over that period will either lock yourself in to a zero emissions future or a high emissions future. I think it's very important to remember these national climate strategies are political commitments. They are commitments from countries to say how they will contribute to the Paris Agreement. So they have some weight behind them. The current pledges that we have on the table, transport emissions are going to increase by 10%. That's pretty much the wrong way, as I understand it. And when I've read every single national climate strategy. It's a labor of love, I can tell you. But half of the countries do include e-mobility strategies, targets, policies, but practically none of them include what they're going to be doing for the infrastructure to charge them. There's no point in buying an electric bus if it can't run. I don't see any benefit in that. And depending on kind of who you talk to, we know that we really need to significantly scale up public charging infrastructure, say, for private vehicles up 14-fold on current rates, buses and trucks up 20-fold by 2035. So there's a lot of work to do. But I think that the actual opportunity lies in these NDC updates. Currently, they're too vague to really know what they're going to be doing. So it's therefore very difficult to hold governments to account. So I think that really climate strategies have to be more specific. They need to really outline what their vision is for their transport sector over that period and how it will deliver this net zero future that we're all looking towards. Countries really need to spell out how they're going to reduce emissions across the avoid, shift, improve approach. Because there isn't a silver bullet solution to reducing emissions from the sector. We need very, very clear targets to say where we're going to be going for e-mobility. That provides market confidence. We need these modal shift targets. We need the integration with renewable energy as well. We need to say who's going to be the lead ministry. National climate strategies are often led by the Environment Ministry. The Transport Ministry doesn't get a look in. So we need to know who's going to deliver it and also how they're going to work with their partners, the private sector and cities as well. We need to say how much it's going to cost and who's going to pay for it. That's another one. Capacity building. We're dealing with new technologies. We need to build those capabilities if we're going to be delivering them in cities, but we also need to bring up the capabilities of our governance arrangements in cities as well. And my kind of final point is the monitoring, reporting, and the verification. We need to ensure that these policies actually deliver emissions reductions, but also actually make our cities, citizens, better places to live. Because we really need to measure the sustainability benefits. Because if you do that, then that helps the real political drive behind it all. So I really do see that we have quite a significant challenge, but many opportunities.
Good to hear. And yeah, that is so eloquently put in terms of the kind of massive challenges, the cost, obviously trying to work out who's doing what within government. And as you say, you've read all those national policies and they are vague, which really suggests there's a very large mountain to climb. I'm going to skip ahead again. Perhaps I'll go to Jamie, because I saw you nodding very, very much to whatever Philip was saying there. And of course, he was making some great points. So give us a sense of the complexities involved, because there are so many, aren't there, in terms of the cost for the infrastructure to put all of this into place. It's not enough to say, yes, let's get some e-mobile green buses, because there's a whole infrastructure element about that. So explain a little bit about that.
I'd like to explain a little bit, or try to explain a little bit on the institutional complexities as well. I think what Philip was saying is that has transport had a seat at the table? Yes, today, but 10 years ago, 15 years ago, much less so. But is our seat fully at the table, or are we whispering things that may not be picked up when it comes to NDCs and LTSs? Maybe my labour of love was reading through all the transport policies that governments have produced across Asia and Pacific region. And there are an awful lot of climate-related decarbonisation documentation policies within the transport documents. Only 10% of those have migrated themselves across to the NDCs. So if we're saying rightly that there is not enough information or detailed information in the climate documentation, the NDCs, the LTSs, relating to transport, in many of our client governments, that information is there, but it's sitting in the transport document. So it's a simple migration of those agreed government policies from the transport sector into the collaborated, coordinated climate change document. So that is good news, that there's ready-made policies that can be put in to enhance that move forward. But it does require closer collaboration within the institutions to get that there. That would very much help the enabling environment. And then to go to your point in terms of the broader complexities, again, on the sovereign side, the government can set those, the enabling environment, and as I said earlier, it will de-risk individuals' decisions or private sector operators' decisions to invest that way. If you know that your vehicle will be obsolete within the next 10 years, your decision to select a different type of vehicle, hybrid, electric compared to combustion engines, is sort of made for you, or at least accelerated for you for that part. But we do need to work with the vehicle manufacturers. We need to work with the power generation to ensure that this policy is there. Just on that power, e-vehicles are a lot more energy efficient than their ICE equivalents. There's much fewer moving parts, therefore a lot less friction. Therefore, even though the grid may not be 100% clean, use of power generation within e-vehicles is actually more efficient than internal combustion engines and fossil fuel use. So, and also the policies for the energy sector are more advanced, and that decarbonisation pathway in the energy sector for cleaner energy it will probably accelerate before the full scaling up of e-mobility adoption. So it will happen, but it's not a case of just trust me, but the policies back this up as well. The energy sector will decarbonise. The power comparison between combustion engines and e-vehicles is more advantageous on the e-vehicle side. So these things are all sort of falling in place. But the final straw is then maybe on the manufacturing side. So yes, there's government, there's private sector, but who is producing these? Where are the raw materials coming from at the end of life? Where will that be used? So we need to look at all of those components to ensure supply chains, environmental impacts, particularly at end of use or end of life or second life, we like to refer to, because those batteries can be very powerful. They may have deteriorated, so they may not be so useful within a vehicle, but they will be very useful in terms of energy storage for households who may be off the grid. So there's definitely a second life before end of life in terms of batteries that we can get within there. So we're looking at all of these parts. Again, referring back to what I said earlier in terms of the Asia and Pacific being quite different from maybe North America or Europe, two-wheelers, three-wheelers are often locally produced to a large extent. So we're not dealing with major international players as we would be in the family car market or the light-duty vehicle market. And that allows us to sort of pilot options and scale them up. Because if the tuk-tuks, three-wheelers, rickshaws, whatever, are sort of locally produced, then working with those local producers to bring in that shift. It gives us a larger opportunity to bring in that other dimension, government, private sector, and vehicle manufacturers, industries as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, and thanks for setting the context and explaining the very, very many complexities there are, not just in terms of infrastructure, but in terms of the institutional complexity as well. Samir, moving on to you now. Obviously, we heard a little bit about financing earlier, but perhaps explain what role financing plays for Revfin in helping transform the sector, because we know, you mentioned earlier, of course, your customer who are the driver-owner segment, they don't usually have much of a credit history. So how do you overcome an issue like that? And are there some peculiarities in the electric vehicle market which really allow you to lend to this sector more easily? So explain some of that for us.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting and a complex question. I think first of all, I've spoken to a lot of people across the world, and I think one thing I commonly hear is the biggest impediment to electric vehicle adoption is lack of financing. Right? So in that sense, financing is going to become, or is already, the largest enabler of electric vehicles. Now, if I look at our, one of the things that we did as an organization very early on, we said that we must, because we are financing electric vehicles, we started about 5 years back. Electric vehicles were still quite new, and still are actually today. So we said we must differentiate customer risk from product risk. And we must look at both those separately, and we must solve for both of them separately. Because traditionally, financiers generally tend to focus only on customer risk. So let me just talk about customer risk first, and then I'll come to product risk. A lot of our customers, as you said, are financially excluded. 85% of them have no credit history. Almost none of them have any relevant banking transactions. Most of our customers haven't done formal schooling beyond the age of 10. So very poor language skills, low level of education, living in small towns, no credit history, no banking transactions. How do you underwrite them? We said, we must try and focus on human behavior rather than credit behavior. And maybe we said that human behavior will give us hints as to how they perform on their financial products. So one of the first things that we did is we said, we partnered with a university, and we said, let's build a psychometric assessment tool that can help measure intention to repay. Yeah. And since we were financing commercial vehicles, we knew the ability to repay was getting created through the products we were financing. So our focus was clearly on intention. So I think somewhere we got that right. We obviously get all customers to go through a psychometric test, but then that gives us a good outcome, so we're able to select really well. It's interesting, for the last 5 years, we've been able to keep our non-performing assets below 1% as well, so the customer selection has definitely been right. Right, and then we also said not just their behavior at the time when they're applying, but we must study their behavior afterwards as well. So we embedded telematics in all the vehicles that we finance. Through telematics, we can look at driving behavior, acceleration, turning, sharp turning, how they charge, how they maintain their vehicles, how the batteries are performing, and so on and so forth. Right, so that gives us a very good idea of how they maintain their vehicles, but also very interestingly, because it's a commercial use case, how much they're driving. Every kilometer driven translates into income for them. So that's also very critical for us to track for different types of end use cases, whether it's a delivery driver versus a passenger vehicle, two-wheelers, three-wheeler, four-wheeler. So with geography, and every end use case in every geography has a different level of income that a person can make per kilometer that they drive. So we track all of that to understand our users much better, and obviously to ensure that they perform well on their loans. So that's on the customer side. Now let me talk about the product side. Product side is also as complex, if not more. Electric vehicle manufacturing, as Jimmy was saying, is a lot of local manufacturing, a lot of new startups coming up. In India, there are over 1,000 manufacturers of electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So who do you work with? Which are the good ones? So that was the first question. And then, of course, there is, which are the good products? How do you assess the products? So we've actually built capabilities in terms of identifying the right OEMs, the right products. We have an engineering team that actually assesses products and manufacturing technology and processes before we actually finance them. So we do that, and then we look at after-sales service that OEMs provide and infrastructure around the vehicles, because that's very critical. A lot of battery infrastructure is not very well set up across the country, which means if there's any issues with the battery, it has to go back to the manufacturing plant to get replaced. It takes about 10-15 days. That's loss of income for our driver, so that's not ideal. So what we really started doing is we said two things. One is we will partner with manufacturers and we will make them participate in the product risk, right? And in two ways. We said if there's a loss to us because of product-related issues, you have to share that risk with us. Equally, there is no secondary market, and until there's a secondary market, nobody's going to finance the vehicles. So we said we have to start creating secondary markets. So we, along with the manufacturers and their dealerships all across the country, we created micro-secondary markets everywhere, which means if a product comes back, it gets refurbished and resold through those dealerships, right? So that really helped us mitigate a lot of the product-related risks. Finally, what we're also doing is we've started working on second life, end of life, etc. So we've actually, again, built an engineering team that's working on vehicles that are coming back to see if we can actually extend their life, whether on batteries or on vehicles itself. And of course, start working on second life use cases. And we've seen some green shoots over there in terms of especially residential use. So there's a lot of areas of India where there's no electricity or throughout the day. So you can actually use those batteries with inverters to actually power the homes.
Thank you. That is such a fascinating list of what Revfin does, and particularly with your customer segment, the fact that you have such extraordinary data on them and their driving habits must be invaluable to many other emerging markets as well, I can imagine.
We've got about 700 million miles of driving history with us now, and that's across the country in about 23 states.
That's amazing. That's a very valuable data set, and really would be very, very helpful for many, many other countries in a similar position, I would imagine. Mayank, I'm going to come to you now. We've been talking about advice, recommendations, and I also notice there are now well over 20 questions in the Q&A. So thank you to all of you for asking those questions. I will get to them shortly. But Mayank, turning to you, what are some of the recommendations that you would provide to private sector companies, governments as well? We've been talking about them, who want to move towards decarbonizing the transport sector.
And it's a very important question, because I don't want to point to either one private sector or one government. I want to point out to the entire stakeholder community, because this journey is well and truly underway. It is happening. But it is so different from decarbonization of energy generation, because that's relatively easier. You have like few large point sources, and so it's easy to have those conversations with them and transition them towards cleaner. But here you have like millions and millions of individual users, and you have to demonstrate the benefits and bring them along with this journey of actually from a cost perspective, but also from a climate change perspective, right? So I would say there are 3 or 4 buckets I would point out where all of us need to apply our minds and work together. One is, I think some of it was already mentioned by Philip and Jamie, is this range anxiety and then this creation of this infrastructure, which is extremely important. And you can tell me, I can tell you, having looked at all these transactions, that's financially not a very viable business at this stage. putting charging infrastructure across country is a very, very low or actually losing proposition from it. So therefore, governments and MDBs, we all need to come together to create this infrastructure. And also there is some technology evolution still happening. There are safety issues with vehicles. The ICE technology is tested over 100 years or so, where people are very comfortable with it. This is a very new technology, and there are still. So I think we all need to work on communications and get people educated and get the right quality standards in place so that the right kind of vehicles come on the roads. That's one part of it. The second, and this is a part where I am actually personally very want to see some real movement happening, is that this, I would call it a revolution, should not happen like the previous move towards carbon-based transport, which is where your raw material is in hands of few countries and then it becomes subject to geopolitical risks, and the countries which do not have that resource actually end up importing a lot of inflation for no fault of theirs, right? So we all must work together, creating resilient supply chains, well-diversified supply chains that meet international best practices on social, environmental, governance, transparency. So that's our role as MDBs, actually. So we are very much focused on it. We will, through the stakeholder community, work on that aspect. Third, and that really gets missed out entirely, is that there is a whole big industry of after-sales services employing millions of people in our DMCs, which actually repair, drive, support ICE vehicle industry. They will lose their jobs as this electrification happens. And this, as we all know, fewer moving parts, fewer need to repair. So how do you transition while making sure that the people who are actually working in that industry do not feel left behind? So in terms of retrainings, re-education, new employment opportunities, again, that is an area which we need to focus on. So I would say there a lot of challenges. I mean, there is a big opportunity, but we need to address these challenges if we are to see actually a smooth and just transition to an electrically mobile future.
Thank you for that, Mayank. And in fact, there's a great question here about after-sales services, which I hope to ask you a little bit later. Thank you again to the audience for contributing such marvelous questions. I'm going to go to Jamie next before I move on to the questions. So tell us a little bit, and obviously you have told us a lot about what the ADB does, but tell us what the ADB does specifically to try to build awareness, because communication, education is a crucial thing, as Mayank just said, to build the awareness of supporting the scaling up of e-mobility in a lot of developing countries and in terms of their policies and actions.
Thank you. It's quite lucky in the fact that this is such a dynamic environment that we're working in or supporting in terms of e-mobility. So that awareness, there is a lot of interest. But the way we're looking at it, we've got to understand what is out there, put that in front of the right people, so we're raising the awareness. But most importantly is downstream action. And that might require piloting until we can scale it up. So that awareness program takes many different things, but it's really putting the information in front of it, from supply chains to second or end of life, looking at all of those components and making sure people are aware. Perhaps more directly working with the governments in terms of ensuring that those transport policies are brought across into the broader climate policies. A number of piloting, we were looking at electric fishing boats. I know, but I guess this is covered under e-mobility, but can they operate in the real world environment, and how do they compete with more traditional forms of transport? So yes, we can look at the two-wheelers, three-wheelers, because they're beyond that tipping point. But local community fishing boats, are they at a point now where we could look at e-fishing boats? Here we're talking individual fishermen going out for a few hours a day, not international trawlers going the far part, but some of it's piloting. And as we heard right from the outset, really the scaling up is where the private sector comes in. So we've been working with a awareness campaigns, doing every 2 weeks a webinar. We've been holding a number of seminars, looking at training, development, and within our clients on the sovereign side, we convened a whole e-mobility workshop up in Seoul, Korea. And the key output there was to talk to those governments about what technical or financial support they may need to build those policies or accelerate it with the enabling environment and the uptake of e-mobility. Happy to say there was 18 countries there, and it led to potential of about 30, 40 different investment opportunities for sovereign or non-sovereign support. That's an awful lot, but how do we put those financing into there and follow through? Ramesh, in his opening statement, mentioned some Green Climate Fund providing 170 million, and with our money close to $500 million in terms of those investments. So that's the action. Now, is it a direct cause and effect between holding a webinar and seeing $500 million of investments? I think you'd be hard pushed to say, yes, this webinar led to $500 million, but without that awareness raising, engagement, working with governments, working with private sector, piloting investments to see how they operate in the real world. There is, in my mind, and within ADB more broadly, there is a direct relationship between the rapid increase we're seeing on sovereign and particularly non-sovereign support and our ability to bring in the world's leading experts in e-mobility, working with Slokat and others in terms of the global debate, but putting that at the local city level, putting that at the national level, and seeing how we can accelerate that uptake in e-mobility. So definitely in terms of raising the awareness, looking at actions, what are the priorities, what makes sense commercially, financially, and how do we really accelerate that uptake? Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, because I did get so many questions after imploring you all to ask questions, I'm going to move on to the questions before I ask my final question now. And there are so many here that are so excellent, but I think, we really want to hear more about Tegeta. So the question here about, did Tegeta find foreign institutions, investors eager to get involved with the green bonds, and Tegeta managed to go beyond the domestic investor base with this endeavor? So tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you for the question. Since last year, we've seen the many development banks and international financial organizations and DFIs who are eager to work with us in many different directions. So as I mentioned, we are mainly automotive industry company, but our infrastructure here in Georgia is the biggest one. We have service centers all over the country. We have showrooms for the automotive directions and brand showrooms and etc. So the short-term strategy in terms of the energy efficiency we do have this strategy to implement solar panels in all our buildings. That's another story as well, and it's related to driving to e-mobility, but still we see other financial organization, ADB as well, to work with us who they want to finance us in terms of the efficiency and e-mobility as well. So this 5 times commitment to reinvest 20 million lari, this won't stop here. We are committed to improving our investment in terms of the greener economy in Georgia and not only.
Thank you for that. There are so many questions. I'm really having to have a look through there. But here's a good one, and it's a very open one that any one of you can answer. What do you see are the 3 major barriers that constrain e-mobility development? Big question. What are the 3? Anyone want to pick up on this? If you had to pinpoint 3, go on then, Philip. I think you've got an answer for this.
Just 3?
Yeah, okay, there's a long list, I know, but just 3. What are the top 3 barriers?
If I look at a city transport perspective, there is the upfront cost. That's always a significant barrier for cities to actually deal with. But I think this is where national governments can play an important role in supporting cities by giving them that financial assistance. So I think that's one of the challenges. Again, for city authorities, it is the infrastructure requirements. Also, where you're going to be, say, for your buses, putting your depots, how that fits within the wider transport system. It takes a very long time to get all the necessary agreements, contracts, etc., between the different authorities, different energy providers as well. So there is that kind of time challenge as well, because your cities are dealing with new partners that they haven't had a relationship really before. So that this is all new to them. And I think related to that is a lot of the technical new skills and the sharing of best practices. I hear so many cities saying we spent roughly 50% of our time getting it wrong. We wish we could follow other people that went first. Not everyone wants to go first. So I think that's always a challenge around this kind of institutional learning. So if I was going to pick three, it'd be those, but like I said, there are a few more.
Yeah, it's a long list, but we're getting there, and we're trying to narrow that list down. Here's a question for Samir, and it was really fascinating hearing you speak about the customers that you have, many of whom are unbanked. Question here about how is the electric charging infrastructure organized in smaller towns and cities in India, and are there common charging facilities specifically for e-rickshaws?
Okay, so I think a bit of a myth buster. Electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers don't require any special charging infrastructure. You can charge them in any plug point. Right, so I say to everybody, there are 250 million homes in India, there are 250 million charging points in India. Right, so I think, so yeah, charging infrastructure-wise not required. When you look at use cases where you have a large number of fleets operating vehicles for last mile deliveries, e-commerce deliveries, over there certainly you require charging infrastructure. It's not sufficient, but also it's not commercially viable, as was said earlier. We see public charging infrastructure utilization is only 4% in India, and private charging infrastructure utilization is 12%. I'm not sure how money can be made out of that. Right, so yes, it'll take time to build that kind of infrastructure. I think it will be built. I think certainly in a lot of the large cities, there is sufficient infrastructure. In a city like Delhi, there'll be probably more than 500 public charging stations, and that's enough for a city. And of course, a few thousand private ones as well. Right, so I think, yeah, it's coming up, but in the smaller towns, you don't need that really. Not for two-wheelers and three-wheelers.
And here's, in fact, another follow-up. And again, this is about your unbanked sector that we talked about earlier. Elaborate a little bit more about how you're addressing the lending and payment needs of the unbanked sectors, many of your consumers within e-mobility in India.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we do, right? We give them loans, mostly their first loans, to buy electric vehicles. They drive these electric vehicles, and the people who are buying electric vehicles were actually in some other profession previously, so they were not driving anything before that. A lot of barbers, factory workers, and casual labor and things like that. And they've really, after buying these vehicles, they've really gone on from earning maybe $100 a month to about $300 to $400 a month through electric vehicles. Right, so I think that's a huge sort of economic change in their life, but then because of that also social change, things like the children being able to go to school and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I think that's what we do, and yeah.
Don't have to be so humble about it. That's quite extraordinary what you do. Now, we talked a little bit about the after-sales service element earlier, and Mayank, you spoke about it specifically, so why don't you take this question? After-sales services seem to be rather critical, including safety standards, especially in South Asia. How does ADB plan to integrate that towards supporting adoption of e-vehicles?
Yeah, that's and it's related to a little bit to what I mentioned earlier, is the quality standards. You work with national governments, state governments to actually put in place appropriate quality standards, certification of vehicles before they come on the road. So that's the upfront work which you do. And then it's after sales service, it's all part of the same puzzle. Which came first? Should the network come first, or should the vehicles come first? So this is all market driven pretty much at the end of the day. We can do something, governments can do something, but at the end of the day, if there is a business proposition there, these service centers will come up. So it will start with larger cities, which will have charging infrastructure, they will have after sales services. In smaller cities and towns, there will be cottage industry which will develop. People will get employment opportunities. They'll start fixing these, and so it'll develop organically. But the most important thing is the quality of the vehicles, which is because it's a safety issue. So that's the most important thing, is to have a standardized quality across countries, across battery types and products, so to ensure that spurious products are not coming into the market, because it's basically a very big risk.
Well, thank you for addressing that. Here's another question. It's got one vote, and it's really quite interesting because I think it ties in what you mentioned earlier, Jamie. You were talking about e-mobility fishing boats. This is a question about shipping at large. Where do we stand, and what are the prospects for making it environmentally friendly? We know that shipping is not part of our conversation here today, but it is huge in terms of its carbon emissions. So maybe just a brief response to that.
Sure, yeah. Maybe it's H-mobility, hydrogen, is what we should be talking about. But as Philip was saying, sort of 2014, we saw a change. I think in the maritime subsector, there has been a change in the last 3-4 years. Bringing them into the climate debate more generally, IMO and the international maritime, has happened. But similar to e-mobility, the key players will drive this. Maersk and some of the big operators have made that decision on where their future investments will be in terms of their vessel fleet. They have decided that hydrogen is the way forward, and will be making investments in there. We're already seeing sort of the green corridor between Asia and North America across the Pacific. Now that is again doing, but we're also within our region looking at more of a hub and spoke at a smaller scale. So if Singapore is a collector port, how do Indonesia, Malaysia, Southeast Asia more generally, Thailand and so on, how do they feed in to that collector distributor? And what type of boats or vessels would we see there? The interesting point I mentioned earlier, so sort of a little bit on the maritime sector, e-vehicles compared to ICE vehicles, there is less friction, therefore they're more efficient. The power unit of hydrogen compared to sort of bunker fuels currently within the maritime, they're not that efficient. So it will dramatically change the routing that is possible, because the size of the vessels, the ships, will have to change. Maybe I'm always the optimist, but we are hoping that this would dramatically improve accessibility to our Pacific countries within the Asian Development Bank. If large ships are going across the Pacific without the need to stop, maybe when we make this transition to ethanol or hydrogen, there is a greater need to change those routes, and therefore there will be stop-offs at points that historically may have happened, but as the vessels got larger and more efficient, there was no need, which may reduce the transportation costs and provide more accessibility. I would like to say finally that yes, climate change is very important, e-mobility or H-mobility is very important, but transport is a neighbour of development, and it must be about access. So we're looking at some of those points in the maritime where that opportunity for increased access to those lifelines that the maritime provides to particularly the island states, which are very remote in many cases. How can we ensure that there is some kind of shift to a cleaner, a better and more sustainable future?
Thank you. I think that deserves a whole panel on its own. It's shipping, isn't it? We've got so many great questions here, but we are running out of time. I will just do one more question. And, this is, again, that question around, okay, which countries should we try to emulate? A question around why is India such a front runner in this, in e-mobility, and how do other countries catch up? But we know it's not just India. In the video earlier, it was China as well. So anyone wants to pick up on, how well these countries are doing, what should we look to in terms of emulating in policies that they've put into place? Jamie?
Just very quickly, I think the collective institutions working on those policies in those two countries you meant, and in other countries, Georgia and Vietnam, and those others that have been highlighted, it's bringing together the right institutions within the government, working with the private sector to ensure that those investments are de-risked and therefore accelerated. And that's what India has done, that's what China has done, that's what many others, Georgia, Vietnam, Thailand, that we see as front runners in our region are pushing the agenda very fast.
So I'll just add on to a little bit. China is obviously way far ahead because China was able to build a whole ecosystem of, from raw materials to manufacturing and government, very strong government push. Some of these moves are also dictated by the countries and its resource availability, right? So, for example, in a country like India, which almost 85% of its requirement of fossil fuels is imported for vehicles, it's an energy independence issue also. So that if you can create a EV ecosystem, then it actually, reduces reliance on imported fuel. So there are policy levers, there are push levers, there are pull levers. Government has actually come up with a very large subsidy program for customers purchasing vehicles, it's called FAME, and also for producers, it's called production and incentives. So it gives that upfront push to bring down the cost so that there can be a faster adoption. And then government has also announced that it is going to procure only electric vehicles. All government procurements are going to be electric. So then that gives a minimum demand, which actually manufacturers can actually start planning their production based on that demand, and then it also allows them economies of scale. So I think some of these things, if government does right, it can actually create a sort of environment which then feeds on itself and creates a virtuous cycle.
Excellent. A virtuous cycle. That's what we want to hear. Not a vicious cycle, a virtuous one. Now, I am going to ask my final question. Thank you all, by the way, for those great questions. There are so many here. If we didn't get a chance to answer them, please do come and find our wonderful panelists later on, perhaps at the reception later, and you can pick up from the conversation. But my final question to all of you is the same one, and do just answer fairly briefly. We've only got 8 minutes left in this session. I'll start with Samir at the end. This is your classic crystal ball gazing question. Where do you see e-mobility in 10 years from now? Samir.
Okay, so I think, I've formed the opinion that e-mobility or mobility in general is more about different use cases and identifying the right sort of vehicle technology for that use case. Right, so when we look at last mile mobility, either passengers or delivery, certainly electric vehicles, and I would expect to see generally across the world that transition would have happened. Right, and then when it comes to larger forms of vehicles, trucks, freight trucks, buses, etc., I think it's going to be a combination of hydrogen and electric. But again, I see almost a complete transition globally over there as well. And finally, I think when it comes to personal use vehicles, four-wheelers, etc., personally, I don't see a use case for electric vehicles at all. Right, and I think even from an energy security or energy diversity perspective, I think it's good to use different fuel forms. So if electric, hydrogen, petrol, diesel, all of those forms coexisting, then I think all of them, there's no scarcity. And also, there's not much impact on pollution as well. Right? So that's how I see it.
All right, 10 years from now. That's your vision. Jamie, what's yours?
For Asia and the Pacific, I see an acceleration, particularly in those lower hanging fruit, the urban fleet vehicles, the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers, where that tipping point has been reached. The problem might actually be the supply to be able to keep up with that accelerated take-up of demand. But the harder to serve e-vehicles, the longer distance buses, the trucks, that may take longer on a more traditional sort of expectation. But I do believe the smaller urban fleets, we will see a rapid increase with the de-risking that was just mentioned in terms of that bulk purchase, manufacturing scaling up. What sort of numbers we're looking at? Maybe quadrupling in the next 10 years in terms of the smaller vehicles, but please come and find me and see whether we're anywhere near it at that time.
We
Thank
will
you.
be talking about this in 10 years. I will hold you to that. And Manana, your thoughts, particularly here in Georgia, what are your ambitions in 10 years when it comes to e-mobility?
Yeah, I would love to emphasize on Georgia. So 10% of the revenues of Teget are driven from the e-mobility and EV sales as of today. And I hope to think this number growing by 50% since in the trucks direction and bus direction as well. That's quite new for the country as well. And EV light vehicles are growing. So like for the last year as well and this year, we've introduced maybe 3 brands, new brands, the Chinese ones as well, who are very new to the country. But in terms of the numbers, I would love to say that in the first week of introducing this exact brand, we've sold in a 1 week 20 units. So that's the demand. That's where we see the growing.
Excellent. And I guess 20 units in a week, that's good. That's good. Excellent.
That's
good to
very
know.
good, yeah.
Excellent. It's great. Brilliant.
Okay,
Maya.
so from my perspective, ever the optimist, so I will actually break it up into 2 parts. One is on an overall macro basis. I really see resilient supply chains, well-diversified supply chains, countries able to source from different sources without being dependent on a single source, and this whole ecosystem of mining, assembling, manufacturing, sales, actually getting well developed across our region. That is one on the overall market side. And for us in the private sector operations department of ADB, I would really hope that we are able to scale up our support to this industry by multi-billion dollars over the 10 years or so. So we are really putting a lot of focus on getting it right, getting the right instruments, the right financing structure, so that we can actually roll out this across our DMCs. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Philip, if you're going to attend COP in 10 years from now, and presumably you'll still be attending, how do you want to see this particular segment, e-mobility, being represented?
What a delightful prospect. I would really like, well, I hope, we have a better appreciation of e-mobility and the policies and how it can really kickstart the decarbonisation of mobility as a whole in the most cost-effective way of doing it. I think the real opportunity is around passenger transport in urban environments. It accounts for 40% of transport emissions in itself. I would like to see greater uptake of e-mobility with the combination of the original sources of e-mobility, zero emissions mobility, that's walking and cycling, but also in combination with public transport. I think it's a totally underappreciated climate solution. It avoids 50% of emissions in cities. And when I say avoid, that's also compact cities, which make it nicer, more pleasant to walk and cycle around. It avoids congestion, so car drivers can have a more pleasant journey themselves. And simply, if you double public transport and walking and cycling in cities, the usage of it, you cut emissions by half in cities. And if you just electrify that public transport network, which is already quite highly electrified in cities anyway, you can really kickstart this decarbonisation in the most cost-effective way. Picking up on Jamie's point, you enhance accessibility, you improve air quality, reduce congestion. And I think, for me, that just makes the economic case for its investment. So I think we really need to look beyond just looking at the technology or the mode of transport and really looking at a whole systems change. And I'll kind of give you my final example about my favorite e-mobility thing and how it can really transform cities. So in Gothenburg in Sweden, there's Route 54, which is an electric bus line, and it has a bus stop in the middle of a library, because they wanted to show to citizens how silent the e-mobility solutions are. And I think if you consider that, then it actually is a game changer for urban planning decisions. You can have bus stops in hospitals, makes it so much easier. And I think you can completely transform how you do, waste collection within cities, so on and so forth. So I would hope to see that change in policy and understanding, and then we'll be in a good place.
Excellent. Well, what a wonderfully appealing glimpse into our future. Imagine having e-mobility bus stops in the middle of a library, hospital, etc., etc. Of course, we never talked about the walking and cycling, but that's a fundamental part as well. We need to go back to that sort of transport and that sense of a mobility. But what an excellent session this has been. You all brought so much to the debate, and there is so much to think about yet, and so many more challenges to surmount. But it looks like Asia Pacific is already in that role, so are countries like Georgia. So a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you, all of you. And thank you, audience, for those great questions as well. Much appreciated. And if we didn't manage to answer your questions, do come and ask us a little bit later. Thank you all.